48 hours ago, Nicolas Maduro was still exercising power inside Venezuela. Today, he is standing in a New York courtroom answering to a judge. Pause there, because this is not normal. A sitting head of state, seized by US forces, removed from his country, placed inside the American justice system. The US government calls it law enforcement. Maduro calls it kidnapping, a prisoner of war. Legal experts warn it may violate international law. And all of that can be true at the same time. I've covered moments when power bends, when it breaks, but this moment is different because once a precedent like this is set, it doesn't quietly disappear. This case isn't only about drugs or indictments. It's about who decides when sovereignty ends and who gets to enforce that decision. If you want clear analysis without slogans, stay with me and share this if you think this line matters. Now, before emotion takes over, we need clarity. What exactly is Nicolas Maduro charged with, and what evidence does the United States say it has? For the US government, the charges are sweeping and deliberate. Prosecutors aren't accusing Nicolas Maduro of turning a blind eye. They're accusing him of running the system. In a federal indictment filed in New York, the US alleges that Maduro, his wife, his son, and senior allies engaged in a long-running cocaine trafficking conspiracy, one that began as early as 1999 when Maduro first entered public office. According to prosecutors, this wasn't chaos. It was structure. They say Maduro and his inner circle abused positions of public trust, corrupted state institutions, and provided protection for massive cocaine shipments moving through Venezuela, knowing those drugs were destined for the United States. The indictment alleges partnerships with groups the US now designates as terrorist organizations. Colombia's FARC, Mexico's Sinaloa and Zetas cartels, and Venezuela's Tren de Aragua. The charges include narco-terrorism, conspiracy, cocaine trafficking, and the use of illegal weapons to enforce the operation. This is not a case built on a single incident. It's a claim of a system running quietly for decades. And to understand how serious that claim is, we need to look at how prosecutors say the machine actually worked. To understand this case, you have to go back long before courtrooms and indictments. US prosecutors say the story begins in 1999. That's when Nicolas Maduro first entered public office. And according to the indictment, that's when the alleged machinery was set in motion. This wasn't about sudden corruption. It was about alignment. As Maduro rose through the political system, prosecutors allege Venezuela's institutions were slowly repurposed law enforcement, border controls, diplomatic channels, not dismantled, but redirected. The accusation is that drug trafficking didn't survive despite the state. It survived because of it. Before becoming president, Maduro is accused of providing passports to traffickers and facilitating diplomatic cover for aircraft used to move drug money back into Venezuela. After taking office in 2013, prosecutors say the environment changed again. Power consolidated, oversight weakened, and the drug trade, they allege, was allowed to flourish for personal benefit, for regime loyalty, and for family enrichment. This is how large systems work. They don't explode overnight. They normalize. And when normalization sets in, crisis doesn't arrive as chaos. It arrives as routine. That brings us to the first moment when this system, according to prosecutors, broke the surface. According to prosecutors, the first visible rupture came when the violence stopped being hidden. This is where the indictment turns darker. US authorities allege that Maduro and his inner circle didn't just protect drug routes, they enforced them. State power, they say, was fused with intimidation. The charging document accuses the group of commandeering state-sponsored gangs and ordering kidnappings, beatings, and murders against anyone who interfered with the operation or owed drug money. This wasn't collateral damage. Prosecutors describe it as policy. They allege that safe passage for cocaine shipments was exchanged for bribes and that punishment followed when deals broke down. Violence became a management tool. At the same time, senior officials, men who controlled police forces and security agencies, are accused of shielding traffickers, housing armed groups, and coordinating with foreign cartels. This is the moment where the alleged conspiracy crosses a line. From corruption to coercion, from complicity to command. And when power learns that fear works, it rarely stops there. Because once violence is normalized at home, the next escalation is scale. Here's what prosecutors say, sat beneath everything you've heard so far. Not chaos. A mechanism. According to the indictment, the alleged operation worked because it fused state authority with criminal logistics. Each side filled the other's gaps. Law enforcement didn't chase shipments. They cleared the way. Prosecutors allege officials provided advance warning of raids, secured transit routes, and ensured ports and airstrips remained open when cargo moved through. Diplomatic privileges, passports, flights, immunity weren't symbols. They were tools. The accusation is that Venezuela became a corridor by design. Cocaine moved north, money flowed back, and at the center of this system, prosecutors placed Maduro himself, not as a distant beneficiary, but as a guarantor. Someone who allegedly ensured loyalty by distributing protection, profit, and fear. This is why the case isn't framed as isolated crimes. It's framed as narco-terrorism, because when criminal networks embed inside the state stops functioning as a state. It becomes infrastructure, and infrastructure doesn't collapse quietly. Which brings us to the second moment, when this system, prosecutors say, drew the world's attention when scale turned into exposure. The second rupture, prosecutors say, came when the operation expanded beyond control. This is where names, routes, and volumes start to matter. US authorities allege that massive cocaine shipments moved through Venezuela toward Mexico and the United States, sometimes hundreds of kilograms at a time. And they say this expansion wasn't accidental, it was coordinated. According to the indictment, senior figures worked directly with foreign trafficking networks. Routes were adjusted, quality was discussed, destinations were chosen based on profit and risk. One allegation stands out. Prosecutors say Maduro's son regularly traveled on flights carrying packages military officials believed contained drugs. They allege he later helped arrange shipments bound for Miami and even discussed sending lower quality cocaine to New York because it wouldn't sell elsewhere. That detail matters because it suggests operational involvement, not symbolic proximity. At this stage, prosecutors argue, the system had grown too large to stay invisible. Intelligence agencies were watching, evidence was accumulating, and the case, they say, was being built quietly for years. This is what happens when power overreaches. The same scale that generates profit also generates attention. And eventually, attention turns outward. Because when a system like this stretches across borders, its consequences stop being domestic. They become global. This is the point where this story stops being abstract. Because while indictments talk about tons and routes and conspiracies, you don't live inside legal documents. You live inside consequences. Prosecutors say this alleged system hollowed out everyday life in Venezuela. Institutions meant to protect people were repurposed to protect power. Law enforcement became selective. Justice became conditional. And when that happens, it's not cartel leaders who feel it first. It's ordinary people. You feel it when corruption decides who gets food, who gets medicine, who gets safety. You feel it when violence isn't punished, but explained away. When fear becomes part of the background noise of daily life. This is why this case resonates far beyond a courtroom. Because it asks a question millions of people already live with. What happens when the state no longer works for you? If this story feels heavy, it should. And if you believe people deserve better than systems built on fear, share this. These stories only matter if they're heard. Because what happened in Venezuela didn't stay in Venezuela. The moment these networks crossed borders, the impact became international. Once those networks crossed borders, the story stopped belonging to Venezuela alone. Because drug routes don't just move cocaine. They move instability. US prosecutors argue that Venezuela became a central corridor linking South American production to North American markets. That meant neighboring countries weren't just observers. They were pulled into the gravity of the system through violence, corruption, and pressure on their own institutions. Mexico felt it through cartel partnerships. Colombia through armed groups operating across borders. The United States through drugs arriving in its cities, and now through a precedent it has set with force. This is where geopolitics enters the frame. When the US designated these cartels and armed groups as terrorist organizations in February 2025, it wasn't just a legal move. It reframed the conflict from crime to national security. And that shift matters. Because once criminal activity is treated as terrorism, the tools change. So do the risks. Allies are watching closely. So are rivals. If a powerful nation can seize a sitting president in the name of justice, others will ask what stops that logic from being used again and by someone else. This case doesn't just test Maduro, it tests the boundaries of the global order. And the future of that order now depends on what comes next. What comes next depends on how the world chooses to respond, not just to this case, but to the precedent behind it. There are 3 paths forward. The first is the contained outcome. Maduro stands trial, evidence is argued behind closed doors, a verdict is reached, and the world treats this as a rare exception, an extraordinary response to extraordinary allegations. The system absorbs the shock. The second is the normalization scenario. This case becomes a reference point, a justification. Powerful states begin framing cross-border seizures as law enforcement, not acts of force. Sovereignty becomes conditional. Justice becomes selective. And then there's the third path, the dangerous one, where rivals mirror the logic, where abduction replaces diplomacy, where courts become battlegrounds for geopolitical power. None of these futures depend solely on guilt or innocence. They depend on whether rules still matter when power is involved. This is the paradox at the heart of the case. Accountability is necessary, but so are limits. If you remove one to achieve the other, the system doesn't become stronger. It becomes unpredictable, and unpredictability is where trust collapses. Which brings us to the final question, the one that matters most. What does this moment mean for you, for me, and for the world we're handing forward? This case will end in a courtroom, but its meaning won't. Because long after the verdict, whatever it is, the precedent will remain. A world leader seized, a trial justified after the fact, power deciding when rules apply. I'm not asking you to decide whether Nicolas Maduro is guilty. That's what courts are for. I'm asking you to notice something deeper. Every system reveals itself in moments like this. Not when it's stable, but when it's stressed. If justice can only function when it's backed by force, then it stops being justice. And if sovereignty can be overridden without consequence, then it stops protecting anyone. Today it's Venezuela. Tomorrow it could be someone else. And one day, the line won't be clear at all. This story matters because it's not finished. It's a warning and a test. If you believe accountability and limits must coexist, share this. If you want to understand how power is changing, stay with me. Because the next chapter isn't about Maduro. It's about what the world decides is acceptable next.